Hi everyone! If you caught our last video, we talked about how Moses knew nothing about Judaism. Today, we're diving into another fascinating historical puzzle. Did Moses even speak Hebrew? Spoiler alert, he probably didn't. And the Hebrew language itself didn't really exist in the way we know it today during the time Moses supposedly lived. Let's break down why. Let's start by tackling the big question. What language did Moses actually speak? If Moses was real, and if he really lived during the 13th or 14th century BCE, and even some scholars suggest that he even actually lived in the 16th century BCE, he most likely didn't speak Hebrew as we know it. Moses, according to the story, grew up in Egypt as a member of the royal court. He would have spoken ancient Egyptian. This would have been the common language of communication in the Egyptian Empire, where he allegedly lived. In fact, ancient Egyptian would have been the dominant language for anyone in his social position at the time. On the other hand, the Israelites weren't yet a unified group with their own distinct language. The languages spoken in the region were closely related to the broader family of ancient Canaanite dialects. This means Moses would have likely been exposed to early forms of Canaanite languages, but not the fully developed Hebrew we think of today. So when did Hebrew actually start to develop? The Hebrew language, as we recognize it, began to emerge sometime around the 10th century BCE, several centuries after Moses' supposed lifetime. The earliest form of Hebrew, known as Proto-Hebrew, evolved out of Canaanite dialect spoken in the Canaanite region. But here is the kicker. It wasn't the dominant language for many centuries. At the time Moses would have lived, there wasn't even a standardized written form of Hebrew. In fact, one of the oldest examples of Hebrew writing, the Gezer calendar, dates to around the 10th century BCE, hundreds of years after Moses. Before this, the writing systems used in the region were more closely related to Egyptian and Mesopotamian scripts. The Hebrew alphabet we're familiar with didn't take shape until much later. But wait a second, if Moses didn't speak Hebrew, why is the entire story of Moses and the Exodus written in Hebrew? That's a great question. Remember, the Hebrew Bible wasn't written until centuries after Moses' supposed lifetime. The stories in the Bible were passed down orally for generations before they were finally written down. By the time these stories were recorded, Hebrew had developed into a written language, and the authors of the Bible were writing in the language that was spoken at that time. This means that the Hebrew we see in the Bible reflects a much later period than the time of Moses. So while Moses is described as speaking Hebrew in these texts, it's more likely that the real and legendary Moses would have communicated in a mix of ancient Egyptian and ancient Canaanite dialects. At the time Moses would have lived, ancient Egyptian was the language of the ruling class and the administrative elite, while the Canaanite dialects were spoken by the local populations in the Levant. Scholars believe that early Israelite language and culture were deeply influenced by both ancient Egypt and the Canaanites. This means Moses, if he existed, would have lived in a world where people were likely speaking a mix of ancient Egyptian, early Canaanite dialects, and possibly even some other regional languages. Hebrew, as we think of it, didn't come onto the scene until much later. So where does this leave us? The idea that Moses speak Hebrew is more of a myth based on the later development of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew language we know today didn't exist during his time. While Hebrew became the sacred language of the Jewish people, it didn't reach this status until much later in history. The Moses story was written down in Hebrew because that was the language of the Israelites by the time the Bible was being composed, long after Moses was said to have lived. And that's okay. The story of Moses is still incredibly powerful, but it's important to understand the historical context. The language and cultural developments we associate with Moses and the early Israelites are actually a product of many centuries of evolution. So, did Moses speak Hebrew? Almost certainly not. But that doesn't take away from the impact of his story on Judaism and the world's history. The language, like religion, evolved over time, and understanding that makes the story even more fascinating.